Welcome to Bring It Home. I'm Craig Fuller here with JP Hampstead, where we talk about the American reindustrialization. JP, last time we got together, we talked about a number of those announcements, big corporations that are investing in production here in the United States, really driving this reindustrialization of the Americas. We have some pretty significant announcements again this week.
Yeah, just a quick rundown of some of the bigger headlines. Johnson & Johnson is investing over $2 billion in a new advanced technology manufacturing facility in Wilson, North Carolina. It's a town of about 50,000 people, about 40 miles east of Raleigh. It's a biologics drug manufacturing plant. They're planning on bringing about 70 novel therapies to market over the rest of this decade, and this facility is sort of set up to support that entire portfolio. It's like a $2 billion high-tech pharma plant, kind of in small town North Carolina.
It reminds me of the Eli Lilly announcement that we talked about last time. GLP-1 drugs that they've invested in, really driving a lot of that manufacturing. But there's so much happening in biopharma, so many new drugs, new technologies that are coming out to really solve these issues in terms of lifestyle. It's interesting when you think about, we've had this so much research and so much science around pharma. Pharma gets a bad rep, and some of it deservedly so, but what we're talking about here is some of the new technologies, particularly using AI, where they're able to actually formulate these drugs through computers and sort of run these high frequency simulations, combined with just the sequencing of the genome, enables this revolution that we've all been waiting on.
Yeah, and the biologics especially, it's not just a chemical compound, but it's literally a living organism that has to be cultivated in these very sort of high-tech, clean, temperature-controlled environments. The whole supply chain has to be temperature-controlled. My daughter, for example, is on a biologic drug for eczema, and it comes in a dry ice, cooler thing, and it works way better than the steroid creams and stuff like that. In any case, I think that these companies see a lot of opportunity in sort of custom biologics. They're very pricey. If you can get them covered by your insurance, it makes sense for the pharmaceutical companies. So that's Johnson & Johnson. Next, we have the giant multinational car maker Stellantis. As you know, Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, but also Fiat, Citroën, Pugo, I think, Maserati. They're investing $406 million in 3 factories in Michigan, in Sterling Heights and in Warren, Michigan, kind of the southeast Michigan sort of traditional auto area. This is all about EVs. So they're building the battery electric Dodge Ram 1500, that big pickup truck, and then also the electric Jeep Wagoneer in Warren they're building.
Electric vehicles, huge story. There's been so much investment, really government-funded investment. Consumer appetite for EVs has been some of the big questions. Are these going to be market viable? I think the auto manufacturers, encouraged by government funding and stimulus and all of these programs, is certainly suggesting or telling the manufacturers that they should be building EVs. Some of the new environmental regulations that we've seen that different states have passed, not necessarily just what's happened at the federal level, but at the state level specifically,
CARB
is encouraging these types of technologies. It is changing the way the auto supply chain works, regardless of whether these, the electric vehicles have short-term market viability. We are seeing the manufacturers go ahead and double down on this technology investment, which is driving an enormous amount of investment in the auto supply chain.
Yeah, and what's your take on these types of electric vehicles specifically, like these large pickup trucks, Jeep Wagoneers? Are those appealing to consumers? Do you think people like those? I understand that they can generate lots of like power very quickly.
It depends on the use case. It's interesting. There was a study that came out not too long ago about electric vehicles, and it's women that actually have all the anxiety. So they're worried about they have range anxiety because, so for instance, I have an electric vehicle. It works well for my use case because I can go from the office to home. I might, run an errand once or twice, but I charge it once a week. Fantastic, it works. If I go longer distances, that's where the problem is. For me, when I'm driving through the week, it's the perfect use case. For my wife, it's different, and the reason is that she's got, we have 5 kids. 4 of them don't drive. So she's got to shuttle them to, soccer practice, and she may get a phone call from the school, and she's got to pick one of them up and take them to the doctor, dry clean, all this stuff. She's a stay-at-home mom. I mean, she has a harder job than I do. She puts more hours in her job than I think any of us do, because just the amount of time it takes when you're managing a household of 4 kids, that's a lot. And so for her, she can't predict what her week is going to look like in terms of the amount of time that she's going to be in the car, the amount of hours or miles that she's driving. So for her, range anxiety is a real thing. The worst thing for her would be if she were to drain the battery thinking, okay, I'm okay, and then get a phone call from the school, or one of the kids gets sick and then has to drive. That's a big problem. This range anxiety thing is real. And I think it is more pronounced in, not for something that impacts me, because again, I know my schedule throughout the week, but someone, I think particularly for women, and mothers specifically, because they're the ones that are more subject. The other thing is, like, some of these charging stations that are not at home are in seedy strip mall locations.
Oh,
and so, like, there's been situations where I've driven to the Atlanta airport or Nashville airport, which is about 120 miles from Chattanooga. And the problem is, like, I'm pulling into this seedy strip station at 2 a.m. thinking I'm incredibly vulnerable. Now, for me, less of a concern, right? I'm a full-size, fairly in shape dude. For her, it's a completely different situation. She's incredibly vulnerable. And I think that's an issue that has yet to be addressed. The range anxiety is a real problem. I think the technology will eventually get there, and we are seeing, improvements in battery technology, improvements in the powertrain, the efficiency of these powertrain. And look, let's be frank, some of the cooler cars that have come out, some of the more innovative cars have come out in the EV sector, because that's where the investment is. Tesla, the Cybertruck, is probably the most iconic one of the
There's
EV
one that parks
generation.
by me in the garage now.
It's cool. Like, my
cool.
5-year-old, I have, a couple toddlers. I have a set of 3-year-olds and a 5-year-old. They're obsessed with the Cybertruck. Like, it's like this thing, like, it's interesting because this is a car, for them, this is like, oh, the Cybertruck is so cool.
Sounds like a couple of like perception problems to solve, more build out of the infrastructure, and we'll see what happens to consumer demand. Once people get more accustomed to these vehicles and how to use them.
Yeah, I think it's, look, I think EVs are here to stay. I think we've talked about this before. Is that I was visiting a presentation that the CEO of North America of Volkswagen gave, which is like, look, $8 billion per auto manufacturer being granted from the federal government to retool these factories and build electric vehicle battery technology and EVs themselves. You're going to get an EV whether you want one or not. And so I think what is interesting isn't the EVs, but these hybrids. It's funny because Toyota didn't go full on EV. A lot of manufacturers said, hey, EVs are the future, we're going all in. Toyota actually, and got a lot of heat over the fact that they didn't go all in on EV. They actually stayed, they were the inventors of the Prius. They were very early
to hybrids.
Years ago, 15 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, I had a hybrid Lexus, which was had an EV battery and took gasoline. Toyota stayed in the hybrid, and I think that's probably what we'll see. Is we're seeing a lot of investment around EV, but I think hybrids are actually probably the best use case for exactly what I talked about. Is my wife specifically, just thinking about her use case, is going to get massive range anxiety because she can't predict her week. And this is true for a lot of, not just women. I mean, there's a lot of men that have this issue as well, but certainly for me, electrics are fine. I know what I'm doing each day. I'm not going to be surprised in intracity. But on that occasion that I do take that road trip, I'd like to not have to pull over to a seedy strip mall. And I think the hybrids are probably the future. Regardless, all this investment, and I say this a lot when we talk about wasted investment that goes in, whether it's venture capital or even government funding, is most of those investments will fail. Most of those investments will fail to achieve a return on investment. But the good news is that investment, there will be byproducts of it, and we will have innovation. And some of what we will end up with will actually be quite productive.
Nice. And to drill down a little bit, like one layer is sort of below the EV economy and the manufacturing of battery electric vehicles, there have been a number of investments by companies that are involved in electricity generation or electric power sort of equipment. Hitachi Energy is investing $153 million to expand 2 factories in Virginia and Pennsylvania and to build a new one in Mexico. These factories, one in South Boston, Virginia, which is kind of Halifax County, kind of the bottom middle part of Virginia, is building transformers. In Pennsylvania, they're building high voltage switchgear and breakers. And then in Mexico, in Reynosa, a new distribution transformer factory. And this is kind of like, they're seeing tons of demand for their products. Hitachi Energy said that their order book has like tripled in the past like 3 years. And so I kind of view this as part of what's enabling electric vehicles to be sold, right? Like upgrading the grid, basically.
The grid has to be upgraded. And I think this is an area where when we look at what's going to drive, whether it's industrialization or just the modern economy, got to have electricity. So whether or not EVs will achieve what some of the more bullish estimates are in terms of replacing the internal combustion engine, the fact is that we are going to have demand for electricity. Electricity is life. At the end of the day, our economy, particularly our modern economy, cannot live and thrive and even exist without electricity. We have to have power. And one of the things that's often forgotten about, we know this because we're supply chain people, is essentially you need grid. I mean, grid is the highways.
Yep.
And our grid is way underinvested in. It is
vulnerable to natural disasters.
We've seen, I mean, look at what's happening in North Carolina right now, is the grid has been out for, and likely could be out for weeks. And so you're seeing that there's an enormous amount of vulnerability. The other thing is, so much investment has gone into solar and wind to create this sort of alternative energy that's quote unquote clean. The problem is that those, sometimes the sun doesn't shine, sometimes the wind doesn't blow, and so you need more persistent power. Nuclear is probably the most, it's funny because we're sort of back to the 1950s.
Right.
We're sort of going back to the future, whereas nuclear now is emerging. People have rediscovered the importance of nuclear energy is it provides a really nice alternative. But let's not forget the fact that all of this energy technology is driving things like AI. Like if you're going to have smart computers and AI in the cloud, you've got to have electricity to power it. And it can't be intermittent electricity. It has to constantly supply it. If you're going to change the way cars and automobiles work, got to have the grid has to be intact. Yeah. And the grid is essentially going to power these vehicles. It's got to be also persistent. So we have all this stuff that's happening around electricity. And it's one of the reasons, frankly, that I think I'm incredibly bullish on the US is so much policy over the last decade has been pretty detrimental to parts of our electric economy. But one thing about the United States that's quite different than the rest of the world is we may have a philosophy on, if you think about during the election 2020, we're anti-fossil fuels. And arguably one of the most progressive administrations that we've had realized a couple years into it that that wasn't a very pragmatic strategy, and it sort of quietly allowed for sort of the proliferation of fossil fuels, or at least fossil fuel exploration, more so than they had before. And so there's a pragmatic element that exists in the American sort of psyche, which is, well, we sort of have all these concepts until it actually impacts our lives or economy, and all of a sudden we sort of move beyond it. And so that's one of the reasons I'm pretty bullish. You don't see that in Europe. You don't see that in Germany, where they decommissioned their nuclear plants and are now investing in coal plants because they have become so dependent.
They almost have like a hysteria, or like some sort of like weird like moral thing about like different sources of energy that's like blocking them from recognizing like viable, options like nuclear or natural gas. I thought it was interesting the other day, Elon tweeted, who's done more for electric vehicles than probably anyone else in America. He said, you shouldn't demonize people who work in natural gas or oil and gas. This is what's like keeping civilization going right now.
I don't think we should vilify the oil and gas industry and the people that have worked very hard in those industries to provide the necessary energy to support the economy. And if we were to stop using oil and gas right now, we would all be starving and the economy would collapse.
People have underestimated the importance of fossil fuels and underestimated the importance of these fuels because they do power the economy. And hydrocarbons are the most efficient delivery method for delivering energy. And that's the part that's often forgotten about, is all of this other technology that we have isn't an efficient delivery mechanism. Like, the crazy thing is, if natural gas were discovered all of a sudden today, and it was not something that was a legacy technology, but it was something that we just suddenly discovered, it would be this profound, it would make the cover of every major newspaper, because it would enable us to have clean energy and abundant supplies here in the US. We would be so excited about it because of the alternative it creates to these other forms of fuel that are perhaps dirtier. In fact, if we hadn't discovered oil and we were a coal economy, we would be so profound on it. And so it's always interesting to me that there's this hatred of fossil fuels, there's hatred of natural gas and oil, when the reality is that drives so much of our economy and enables all of these other technologies. I'm very bullish on technology, and I think eventually technology, we will look at oil in 30 years or maybe 200 years and look back and say, well, that was a dirtier technology than what we have today. But today we don't have those alternatives. We need oil, we need natural gas, and not just for energy and power, but for all of the other things that these technologies give us, that these compounds give us.
Plastics and all that stuff.
Yeah, like so much of our economy is dependent upon oil-driven stuff. So, and it's an area that we lead. I mean, one of the things that I'm 45 years old. You're a bit younger than me, but I remember growing up in the 80s and being told peak oil, but also the fact that we were so dependent upon importing oil, particularly from the Middle East, is that we had to be there. One of the interesting things I think that U.S. energy production has given us is the ability to essentially not have to intervene in these conflicts. Take what's happened in the Middle East. It's a tragedy and a travesty, but in some ways, by us not having to intervene and the optionality, we're letting things play out the way that we're letting those groups of folks sort of deal with their issues. That doesn't mire us in what could be a pretty protracted war.
And we're also not in like an energy crisis.
No energy crisis. Yeah. I mean, oil's at $70 a barrel, and the Middle Eastern countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, has lost their ability to manipulate global oil prices simply because the United States is producing so much. And I'm excited. Our guest here today is going to talk all about oil and what's happening around oil production. We've got an exciting opportunity to really dive into oil supplies and what's happening there in the oil patch.
We're going to need a shitload of power for all of these computers. Bitcoin mining, artificial intelligence, all of this high performance computing is going to need one thing: more power. That's why we're bringing everyone from energy and computing together in the greatest city on earth, Houston, Texas. We have people from all walks of life and energy, from oil and gas, renewables, and power generation, to leaders in tech that are building hardware and software for the future. This is our third year hosting Empower and has become a prime spot to connect with others in the industry and spark ideas. Maybe you're an energy producer looking to partner with data centers and Bitcoin miners, or you're in tech looking to connect with others on the energy needs of high performance computing. Or you could be new to the space and you just want to get your foot in the door and learn. There's going to be content and opportunities for people from all different backgrounds. Head over to digitalwildcatters.com.
We're back here with Collin McLelland, our guest here today. He is the CEO and founder of Digital Wildcatters, a community that brings together the oil and gas industry to talk about all of the innovation that's taking place, the future of the energy industry, really based in Texas, centered on what's happening in and around oil and gas and how it impacts everything from the industry itself to the economy at large. Collin, what inspired you to start this business?
Yeah, well, first off, guys, thanks for having me here. I was telling you, every time I've been to Chattanooga is to visit FreightWaves, and so the second that I got a call about what the show was and have the opportunity to be on it, I was on a plane to get up here because I love the idea of it. And yeah, just real quick, background on myself. Back in 2010, I got into the oil and gas industry straight out of high school. So I grew up in a place called Midland, Texas. If you ever seen the movie Friday Night Lights, movie was based there. My school was Midland Lee. Opposing school was Odessa Permian, and so that's what most people know that area for. But it's also the heart of the biggest oil and gas play in the United States, and really is the powerhouse for what the United States is built on. And so out of high school, I started roughnecking on drilling rigs, one of the more dangerous blue-collar jobs in the world. Learned how to drill wells for a couple years. Then I moved into fracking, learned how to frack wells. And then I moved to Houston in 2014. I took a job that had me all over the Western Hemisphere managing drilling operations. So I got to spend time on deep water drill ships in the Gulf of Mexico. I spent time on the North Slope in the Arctic Circle with the polar bears. I drilled wells in Los Angeles in the middle of golf courses. A lot of people don't know that Los Angeles is a really powerful oil and gas play, and really got to see boots on the ground oil and gas operations all across the United States, and saw that transition from conventional to unconventional assets in the Shale revolution and knocking off OPEC as the powerhouse that they were.
It's an amazing, what's happening with gas. JP and I touched on it. Has been tremendous. Just in my lifetime, and really within the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. I went to school at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and there was a bunch of kids from the oil and gas industry. And I remember hearing them talk about some of the new technologies that were coming. We'd have these conversations about were we going to run out of oil, because there was a belief in the 90s that was like inevitable, that the United States and just globally we're going to run out of oil. That hasn't happened. What is the story there?
Yeah, I mean, what's happened with American oil and gas production is nothing short of amazing. It is a technological revolution. And, there's this clip from Steve Jobs back in the late 80s or early 90s, and he talks about oil and gas being a technological revolution, especially petrochemicals, and how that unlocked all of this energy and allowed humans to spend more of their time thinking and then build computers. And then he started talking about how computers someday you'll be able to ask it a question and get an answer, and starts talking about AI. And so to really see over the last 100 years what oil and gas has enabled us to do. And if you look at that, that time period from the early 1900s to, let's call it, the early 2000s, things didn't really look that much different. If you look at the drilling rigs that I worked on in 2010, I can go find pictures from the 30s and 40s. Looks like the same exact drilling rig. Like, I could go work on that rig. Those guys could, if they could come into the future, they could work on that rig. So what changed? Around the 2010 timeframe, we really started looking at shale formations. And so the way that we used to drill wells is, shale is the source rock for oil, and oil would start seeping up and it would get caught in these traps or these salt domes. And so what would happen is we'd drill a vertical well down into these salt domes, into these pools of oil, and we'd suck it out like a straw. That was essentially how it happened. But what we found out is that the oil actually originates in what we call the source rock, the shale. But the problem is you can't drill a well and go vertical into that, because shale is a very low porosity, low permeability type of rock. So oil doesn't flow. So if you drilled a vertical well into that, you just wouldn't have enough exposure to the rock to make an economic well. So what happened is some really smart people, both in engineering and in finance, figured, hey, we can drill straight down, and then we can kick off our well and go horizontal and drill right through that shale rock. And so we can get 10,000 feet of exposure to that rock, and then we can frack it, open it up, bust the rock open so that oil can flow through. And what this really enabled was this quote unquote manufacturing process. And it allowed capital to come in and deploy capital at scale. So if you look at, our company's called Digital Wildcatter. Some people are probably like, what is a digital wildcat? I don't know what is a wildcatter. The term wildcatter is a term, you had these guys in the 1900s all the way up to the 80s and 90s that would take incredible amount of risk drilling a well. You'd look at some seismic and geology and things of this nature, and you'd have a map and you'd say, hey, I think this is a really good place to drill a well. And you'd go spend the money and drill that well, but you might have a dry hole. That was a very common thing. So that was kind of your boom and bust of riches in oil and gas. Hey, you either struck it rich, had oil shooting out of the ground, or you had a dry hole. But with the shale revolution, what it allowed was this very predictable manufacturing process where you said, hey, no, we know the shale rock is here, and now we are going to go drill multiple horizontal wells into that formation. So now if you go out to West Texas, you'll go out to a single pad, and some of these pads have 20, 30 wellheads on them with wells going out in all different directions, tapping into these different pay zones in shale. And so what that allowed was Wall Street, private equity to come and really deploy capital at scale and have this ability to underwrite these projects with a risk-adjusted, mindset and basis to where they could cut billions and billions of dollars of checks to deploy these assets.
So Collin, is it fair to say in the old days, it was almost like shooting a dart where you had to be pretty precise on where, like, you knew there was oil under there because of all the sort of seismic, like engineering and science they would do, but they didn't know exactly how to get to it and extract it. And so they would, it was like shooting a dart and you only had so many shots. Where what you're describing now is more like a shotgun approach where they can basically blast a bunch of these, horizontal rigs in there, and they only need to get one. Am I understanding that correctly?
You're a little bit off. And so it's not a shotgun approach necessarily in the way that you're saying it. So there's the idea or the concept of a dry well in shale just really isn't a thing. When you drill a well, you have a very high probability of producing that well on an economic basis. And so it's not really a shotgun approach of, hey, we're going to drill 10 wells and hope that, 3 of them hit. So we're going to drill 10 wells and all 10 of those are going
how does that change?
Yeah, it's a fundamental geology concept here. And so if we're drilling a vertical well into one of these pools of oil in a salt dome, your seismic could show that, hey, we're looking at our resistivity and all of our different logs here, and it looks like there's oil, but you don't know until you go down there and actually drill the well. And so you could drill the well and get down there, and it could turn out like, hey, your reads on everything were just poor and bad. The other thing about these conventional vertical wells is that you may have a pocket of oil over here, and you may have one over here, and you may have one over here. So it's very sporadic, and it's not very standardized. Like what you did over here may not work over here on this well. Whereas in shale, since we're going straight into the source rock where those hydrocarbons were cooked and originated, we know where that shale rock is, and we drill wells predictably horizontally into that shale rock. And so just the idea of having a dry well is kind of a foreign concept, which actually brings up an interesting issue. If you look at millennials like me, we aren't good conventional oil finders, and that's a little bit terrifying of losing that tribal knowledge with the older generation.
Because you moved full into shell.
Yeah.
All the engineers have moved into shit. They don't know how to do traditional.
Yes, it's more of a manufacturing process, and so it's kind of easy, and that brings up a very interesting dynamic.
So this more predictable way of producing oil allowed capital to come in at scale because they knew the kind of yields that they would get on their investments. And that helped transition the United States from being a net importer of energy to a net exporter of energy.
Yeah.
What does that do for American industry and just for our sort of place on the world stage?
Yeah, the United States has experienced the most prolific economic boom over the last 14 years since the '08 Great Recession. And that was carried by cheap and affordable oil and natural gas that was produced by the American Shale Revolution. If you go back and look at the thesis around liquid natural gas, Sharif Suki started building a import terminal. That was the original thesis, is like, hey, the United States is going to need a lot of natural gas, and we just do not have it in the United States to provide that supply. So we were actually spending billions of dollars in investor capital building these import facilities. Then overnight, literally overnight, we become a energy powerhouse in producing natural gas. Sharif Suki has to go raise billions of dollars to outfit this import terminal into an export terminal. And so it was really that quick. And that has fueled the American economy and allowed us to enjoy this prosperity that we've had. And the other thing that I would just want to add on to that is, if you look at the United States CO2 emissions, CO2 emissions have also been driven down too, and that's a result of natural gas displacing coal. It's a cleaner fuel source. And
one of the fascinating things that most people don't realize is that the United States is producing more oil and gas than ever before in its history. Yet carbon emissions, per capita have been declining for 50 years.
Yeah.
And it's hard for some people who have simplistic views of this industry to hold those two facts in their head at the same time.
A funny story, this is just a little bit of an anecdotal story, but I was talking to a group of lawyers over in the UK, and I was talking about how natural gas was really the future of energy, and how it burned cleaner than coal, and the whole story around the United States. And this has also happened in the UK as well. And one of these attorneys fact checked me. And he's like, Collin, I'm listening to you talking here. And he's like, I went and looked this up. He's like, you're completely right. The UK has been able to drive down their CO2 emissions from the transition from coal to natural gas. He's like, but he's like, the way I'm seeing it is that might be harder to take that material step change from natural gas to 100% renewable. So when you start looking at the data and start really trying to understand it holistically, you see that picture. It's very clear to paint that.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago I was in London, maybe when I was first starting FreightWaves, and they'd actually it was a day where there was no coal burning. It was like they had reached that milestone. It was 2016, 17, where there was a day of no coal burning. And it was the gift that we've gotten from natural gas is really delivered so much. I am curious, so you said this revolution, is there a date of as a pilot, the Wright brothers' first flight, 1903, is the date of the aviation revolution? Is there a date and maybe a pioneer or an entrepreneur that figured this out that really enabled it?
Yeah. Not a specific date. I'll give you some general times. And so fracking technology was actually invented back in the 50s and 60s. And so that's when we really actually started thinking about fracking, which is the technology to actually fracture the rock and increase the flow of hydrocarbons. But it wasn't until early 2000s, 2008, you had I'm going to throw out a few names here of who were kind of pioneers. George Mitchell, he's always regarded as the father of fracking. Aubrey McClendon from Chesapeake. Aubrey was probably the biggest driver for the Wall Street capital injection. I mean, the guy just knew how to attract those investors and sold them on this idea of natural gas abundancy and horizontal wells. T. Boone Pickens was another one. T. Boone had a great vision for the use of compressed natural gas in vehicles and things of this nature. And that's probably a short list. There's probably many, many more that should be added to that. But if I really look at kind of a time period of when did the Shale Revolution begin, that was 2010. I mean, that's
right at the height of the financial crisis started in 2008.
Yeah.
I imagine that may have been some of the sort of created the foundation or the environment for finding more efficient ways to drill for energy.
Oh, 100% did. So if you look at it, I started drilling in 2010, and this was in the Great Recession. It was in an oil downturn. And so keep that in mind. I mean, we're in this bottom of the pit, and that's where the shale revolution really began, because at that time I was still drilling vertical wells, and you kept hearing about these horizontals that were coming online. And to give you an idea of the technology development that happened, like I was telling you guys earlier, if you looked at the rig I worked on and the rigs from the 40s, 50s, they looked almost the same. If you looked at the wells that I was drilling, it would take us anywhere from 15 to 20 days to drill an 11,000 foot vertical. Now it takes us 11 days to drill a 20,000 foot horizontal. What enabled that? One, drill bit technology. So we went from using these tricone roller bits to using PDC diamond bits that just allowed us to chew through rock a lot faster. The rig technology, we went from running these little, they were called rotary rigs or Kelly rigs, where essentially you'd have a table that would turn, to where we went to top drive rigs, where you had this huge, it's almost like an impact drill, where you'd have a drill on the top of the derrick and it would almost drill the pipe in. And so just the amount of technology that went in this, both in the subsurface and the tools that we actually used, and the surface technology in the evolution of our rigs. I mean, just much bigger rigs. You went from rigs that were capable of 5,000 PSI to rigs that were capable of, 7,500 PSI. And so just really incredible technological revolution. And I think that was enabled by two cities that are really important and special to me, are Midland, Texas and Houston, Texas. And the entrepreneurial spirit of both of those places is just undeniable. I mean, just the amount of creativity and ingenuity you have in engineering. And, one time I was in a roundtable discussion with Senator Ted Cruz, and he said the only place in the United States that the shale revolution could have happened was in Texas, because it is a crazy idea to tell people, hey, we're gonna drill up in the Barnett outside of DFW area, not far from Waco, we're gonna drill wells under neighborhoods and extract hydrocarbons. And it was really our regulatory environment that allowed us to be able to build and do that, which is that's a very tough issue in the United States right now. It's just the ability to build and do things.
I remember buying, I've had a few houses in Texas, and the mineral rights issue always comes up when you sell a house, because it's not something we think about here in Tennessee. It's like mineral rights in like a neighborhood. Like if you live out in the farmland, mineral rights is a different thing, but it was a big issue. It's like, are you going to sell your mineral rights along with selling your house? And I'm like, of course I would. Like,
yeah, the homeowners association meetings and outside of the Fort Worth area were just kind of crazy, because you had to pull them together. And if you had one neighbor that didn't want to sell their mineral rights, and that's a really interesting thing in Texas and the broader United States, is that there's a separation between owning the surface and owning the mineral rights. And so most of the mineral rights in Texas aren't owned by the surface owners. And so
my former father-in-law had a house in Arlington, and he sold his mineral rights and making not a fortune, but making a nice, paying the mortgage through selling the oil that's under the house. Like what is it, a couple hundred feet maybe? Under the house. So.
Yeah, it's funny. I used to own these oil wells in Oklahoma outside of Tulsa, and the wells that I owned, they're not these high-tech wells that we're talking about. They're little 3,000 foot old, we call them stripper wells, because they strip oil. One of them would produce 200 barrels of water and 2 barrels of oil. So it was a water well that just happened to skim a little bit of oil. But that well in particular was drilled in 1982, and the lady that was the mineral owner, that was her income, was living off of that, and it was for a long time. And so there's an entire industry of mineral owners and a entire portion of generational wealth that has come through mineral ownership. And that's really interesting about the United States, because every other country in the world, minerals are owned by the state. And so that's enabled Americans to become wealthy and rich. Yeah.
So Collin, I this whole show that we've got, and this sort of theme about American reindustrialization and the importance of it, without the shale revolution, is it fair to say that the United States would be a dependent economy on, foreign countries and importing just importing oil, and our economic destiny would not be in our own hands.
100%. And I think it's important to also approach this conversation with nuance, because I think that the idea of energy independence that's a fallacy. It's a pipe dream. There is no such thing as energy independence. I mean, even if you look at it today, we still import a ton of oil because our refineries are configured to refine heavy crude, which is produced in places like the Middle East, where shale is a light crude. So we still actually export a lot of our oil to be refined in other parts of the world and import a lot. And so I think that it's important to understand that oil and gas is a global market. We are one participant and player in that market. The short answer to your question is 100% yes. So, I mean, if it wasn't for shale, we would be much more dependent on OPEC and Russia and China and these companies or these countries, which I think also brings up an important, I think about energy holistically, from renewables, whether it's wind, solar, whether it's geothermal, nuclear. And you look at the supply chains. You guys spend a lot of your time thinking about supply chains. You look at renewable energy like solar. I mean, China owns a majority of that supply chain, from the metals and minerals that are used to the manufacturing of those solar panels as well. And so I think the right approach to think about energy is, how do we become more energy diverse and make sure that we're not dependent on any one source, any one country, and stop thinking about it in terms of energy independence, because I think that's a fallacy.
So in supply chains and in freight movement, in the early 2000s, the railroads started to take some market share. And I remember this big argument about, we're trucking, we're not a railroad. And there was this sort of like friction between the trucking companies and the railroads. And then you had air freight, and you had all these, everybody was very modality specific.
Yeah.
Whereas in the last 20 years, what's actually happened is this emergence of just what is the best modality to move the freight from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. And what you're saying is very similar to that, which is, at the end of the day, whether it's solar, wind, oil, nat gas, nuclear, geothermal, or some new technology that we haven't discovered yet, it doesn't matter. It's the ability to produce energy and to own our energy destiny is really what really matters.
I love the analogy that you brought up about shipping logistics. I wasn't aware of that, and it does remind me of the oil and gas industry, where you had oil and gas companies that are pure play oil and gas. This is what we do. But then you have the bigger companies like the Chevrons and the BPs of the world. And I've always laughed and said that, there's no one more capitalistic than the oil and gas industry. If there's a way to make money on an energy asset, these companies will do it. And so I have a big belief that if you look at any of these growing energy verticals, whether it's wind, solar, geothermal, lithium mining, things of this nature, it's all dependent on expertise and resources from the oil and gas industry. And so, I'll give you a couple examples. The leading geothermal company in the world right now is Fervo Energy. And Fervo is, they call it advanced geothermal. The CEO of Fervo, his name's Tim. Tim is a oil and gas completions engineer, and looked at the technology that we used to drill horizontal oil and gas wells and went and applied that to the geothermal industry. And what they're doing with these geothermal plants is drilling these geothermal wells and then co-locating with manufacturing facilities to sell electricity to them through a power purchase agreement. And so I think that's what's interesting to me, is energy is energy. Doesn't matter if it's oil and gas, solar, wind. And the thing about energy is it's very geographically dependent. You're not going to have hydro out in West Texas in the desert, but up in Canada, you can run the majority of your electricity off of hydro because of the resources that you have available. And so that's a big component to this, is you work with the resources that you have in your area.
That's a great point, Collin. And it's fascinating to me to think about, a company or an industry or a country kind of choosing its energy strategy based on, geography, natural resources, and then like the needs of a specific, the use case of a specific industry, and that co-location idea, where heavy industry as a consumer of energy needs to be placed strategically with regard to an energy asset, is really powerful. Can you give us some examples, like in Texas or elsewhere, where you've seen kind of new industries come in specifically for energy?
Yeah. Before I answer that question, let me back up a little bit, because you guys were talking on the intro about the grid needing to be upgraded. And the primary bottleneck to energy in the United States is transmission. It's not really a power generation issue. We can generate a ton of power through renewables, natural gas, nuclear, things of this nature, but it's a transmission issue, getting power from point A to point B. Craig, you brought up a point about how fossil fuels were the most energy efficient way of transmitting energy. That's true. I mean, there's a lot of energy efficiency loss when you're transmitting electricity over long periods of land. So the transmission issue is a huge issue. What's really keeping us back from doing that is regulatory. FERC is the one that handles permitting from transmission lines, and it is impossible in this country right now to build a transmission line and to build a pipeline. And so that's the real bottleneck that we need to be focusing on, is the ability to build transmission and get energy from point A to point B. We can generate a ton of electricity. We just need to be able to transmit it. And this kind of leads into my bigger thesis on manufacturing, onshoring, and then co-locating with energy assets. That way they can get cheap and reliable electricity right at the source.
So if transmission is the bottleneck, then it becomes even more important for the manufacturing to be located close to the energy.
So there's a term for it. They call it distributed energy resources. And so, and then software is enabling a lot of that too, to be able to manage these different assets. And so your question, JP, on examples, I'm going to talk about high performance computing in Texas, because Bitcoin mining has just taken off in Texas, being able to plug into ERCOT and also off-grid. GPUs for AI, this is all the rage, and it makes me smile a little bit, because I've been talking about this thesis for 3 or 4 years now about the rise of high performance computing and the energy that will be needed for it. And now it's kind of getting the primary attention now with the rise of AI and GPUs. And so you're going to see this. Microsoft just announced that they are restarting 3 Mile nuclear plant. What I find really interesting about that is that they're paying a premium for that electricity. And so that kind of blows out the thought that, everyone's going to look for the cheapest energy. Microsoft's actually paying a premium for that low carbon electricity. But the problem is that there's very little low-hanging fruit in the nuclear space. There's not a lot of 3 miles to just bring on and turn on. And so over that next 5 to 10 years, where is this electricity going to come from? One, it's going to come from natural gas. Natural gas is the most dispatchable electricity there is. You need a gigawatt of power, you can go get that pretty quick through natural gas. Obviously, what we're seeing on the rise of solar, I want to give a little bit of shout out to Texas here, because I don't think people realize just how much of a powerhouse the Permian Basin is. It's the leader in the nation for wind generation. Soon, I believe that they will take over for
windy, sunny, and oily.
It's windy, sunny, and oily. Yeah, it's a desert. You don't have any trees, you don't have any water, but what you do have is a lot of sun, a lot of wind, and a lot of oil and gas. And so it's not only the leader in oil and gas generation, it's the leader in wind, and soon will
there's
be
also
solar.
There's not a lot of conflict on NIMBYism that exists in so many parts of it, because it is a desert.
It's a desert,
and the reason there's an economy out there is because of oil and gas.
Yeah, I mean, look, everyone that lives out there comes up through the energy industry, and so you have an understanding of that. People just care about if they get paid, and so that's what they care about. But there's obviously issues with renewables being intermittent and things of this nature, but the amount of battery storage that is coming online in Texas is also pretty insane. And I think that battery technology will continue to develop and get better over time as well. And so, and battery technology is not only for renewables. I had my eyes opened up to this one time, is if you look at just your kind of rule of thumb on a generator, whether it's diesel, natural gas, is the generators are meant to run under 80% load. And so if you just have them spinning and not actually producing electricity, it's pretty inefficient. Whereas if we use battery technology, you could use a generator, could be a natural gas or diesel generator, to charge up the batteries turn off the generator, and then draw from the batteries. That way you actually have more efficient energy spend. And so, these things are too often are politicized and talked about in silos, but if you actually think about it pragmatically and how it all plays together, you can see in the future, 10, 15, 20 years from now, we can have a pretty harmonic system of how all of these things work together.
Collin, one of the things that I think we've been diving into is the reason of like, not only is this happening, but why is this important? And I think about, if capital formation, keeping capital in the United States, but also is most of the manufacturing, the technology innovation, actually American companies and entrepreneurs and businesses that are actually creating the technology that's driving this? Or is this stuff that we're importing from Taiwan or from the Middle East? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. Let's talk about oil and gas specifically. I think people that aren't familiar with industry, all they ever hear about is big oil, and it's like, what is big oil? Well, that's going to be Exxon, Chevron, BP, but I don't think people understand that the oil and gas industry, there's thousands of companies. I mean, there's thousands of oil and gas producers, thousands of oil field services, and then that just goes downstream to people that make valves and different parts. And so the oil and gas industry, the only foreign component of that is probably the pipe, steel tubing coming in from places like China. But I mean, the oil and gas industry is, very much a pure American effort. Now, when you look at the renewables, a lot of renewables are imported from, I don't know the specific breakdown off the top of my head between China and Taiwan and Korea in terms of solar module exports, but that's where solar panels come from, is different parts of Asia. And so I think that we're heavily dependent on Asia. And if you look at China specifically owning the metals and the mining in parts of the world like Africa, that becomes pretty concerning, the risks that we have in the supply chain there. And so back to my point earlier, is like we should really focus on diversity in the supply chains and the energy sources, just to make sure that we're not someday dependent on China.
I've had the opportunity to tour the Middle East, or been to a number of the cities and countries there, whether we're talking about Dubai or what's happening in Saudi Arabia with some of the really, call them ambitious projects there. All of that is funded by oil and gas.
Yeah.
Mostly sort of, a lot of it is American dollars that have funded it, but also Chinese dollars yuan that have funded that.
Yeah.
When we look at the amount of capital that's staying in our economy, what does that do for America, the American economy overall, if we're keeping our dollars here and they're not exporting to other countries to build these extravagant projects?
I mean, look, the opportunity that I had as a kid to work in the oil field and build a career was provided by Wall Street and private equity injecting capital into Shale. And so you can see kind of on a micro environment how that money comes back to our community and helping us. Also, private equity had a ton of losses in the Shale revolution, so I also think that Wall Street subsidized a lot of growth in the U.S. economy and energy production, and we're very thankful to them for that.
We've seen that in logistics and supply chain. Unnecessary capital investment or misplaced capital investment.
Yeah, and I think the reason that Wall Street loves investing in the United States is, one, rule of law. You have the certainty that you can make an investment in an oil and gas asset and that it's not going to be taken over by some random cartel or pirates, or just a government changing hands, which is, you see this happening like right now in Guyana. Guyana has this miraculous offshore discovery that happened a few years ago, and they've started producing it. And the economic development that you're seeing and the rise of GDP in Guyana is staggering. And now you have different countries that are interested in that. You have some feuds between some of the major oil and gas companies, legal battles on it. And so those are just things that you get to mitigate a little bit while you're in the United States.
Just the capital, the dollar staying here and circulating our economy has got to be tremendous. The jobs that oil and gas are creating.
Yeah, one time I'm gonna give a quick shout out. If you go to Digital Wildcatters YouTube, we made this documentary on the prosperity that natural gas brought to Southeast Ohio through the Marcellus and Utica Shale. And we went to this 4th generation dairy farmer, and the guy is, one of the best people out there. I love getting to spend time with him. And he represented 2,000 landowners in Southeast Ohio for this natural gas transaction. And on his property, on his farm that his family's had for 100 years, there's 4 natural gas wells on it. And the thing about horizontal wells, JP, I wanted to tell you about this a little bit in the transition from the conventional verticals to horizontals. Is when we did conventionals, you had to plug a well here, a well here, a well here. Now you have an incredible amount of energy that is produced from 4 wells that take the 4 wells on surface are probably 15, 20 feet apart. They're very tightly packed. And then your entire pad for that is, maybe, 100 feet by 100 feet. Very small concentration of land use. And so no disruption to this family's farm. And he has taken all of the proceeds from his mineral ownership in that and completely automated his dairy farm. He gets up in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, checks his software. He has the cows, the dairy cows go into it looks like a NASCAR pit stop. They walk into the stall, lasers come out, puts the suction cup on, milks the cow. They have RFID tags so it knows which cow it is. They go out, it scoops up all the cow manure into a Roomba, like this little Roomba bot, puts it out. He doesn't even feed them. It's got a claw that gets all of the grain and the hay and knows the exact measurements. And so this guy, Larry, who you shake his hand and you can just tell he's been working all of his life.
He's shoveled enough manure.
Shoveled manure all of his life. And now he's got
living a good life.
He's got this fully in terms of automation, I've seen some pretty cool automated operations in industry, and Larry, the dairy farmer with 70 heads of cow, is at the forefront of it, and that was enabled by his mineral ownership in natural gas wells.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So Collin, before we wrap up,
story.
a lot of conversation about running out has been, everyone's like, we're going to run out of oil, we're going to run out of natural gas. What is the supply? What does the supply story look like for the next, couple generations?
Yeah, this is a big topic even in the oil and gas industry because, as I told you, we're going straight into the shale, so we're going straight into the source rock. After that, there is no more oil and gas. That is where the hydrocarbons cook and originate at. And so, we chewed through a lot of the tier 1 inventory in shale in the early days, made a lot of mistakes in it. Now we're moving into tier 2, tier 3 inventories. And so, what is peak oil and gas? Anytime someone talks about peak oil, are we talking about peak demand or peak supply? In this conversation, we're talking about peak supply. We have so much oil and gas on this planet, it is almost impossible to comprehend. We just talked about the Guyana discovery. That is a massive producer in its own right. And so I don't think anyone can sit here with a straight face and tell you definitively of when peak supply will be. I know from a natural gas perspective, we have enough to last us centuries. It's a huge amount. And then as we move forward into the future, something I've been diving a lot into is the future of synthetic hydrocarbons. And so there's already a lot of companies out there that I'm friends with that are looking at, okay, how do we make hydrocarbons in a lab? So part of this could be using heat to dissociate CO2 molecules and break them down and turn it back into a hydrocarbon, which that's really enabled by the rise of nuclear and being able to use heat from nuclear to do that. I have friends that are using biological methods to go into reservoirs and take residual natural gas and turn it into hydrogen. They've also partnered up with Oxy, has a CO2 injection project. They're taking that CO2 and they're cooking in the reservoir to take that CO2 and turn it into ethylene. And so the thing is with these synthetic hydrocarbons is you can actually make pure higher density fuels in a lab, and that technology is really developing.
And much cleaner, I imagine.
Much cleaner, burns cleaner as well. Yep.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually a big believer that we'll be using hydrocarbons for the next several centuries at minimum, and especially as we get into space exploration, colonization, industrialization. You need hydrocarbons to get to space. You need it for rocket fuel, and then once we get up there, you're gonna need to get back. And you just look at the resources that are in space. Titan is a moon where it rains hydrocarbons. They have oceans of methane. And so you think that we're not going to tap into that when we're into space colonization. So
it's such a powerful, I look at what the fossil fuel revolution has given, and we're talking industrial, back in the 1800s.
Yeah.
I mean, things like, and this is a controversial topic, but it's true, is like slavery, like it enabled us to eliminate the need for human sort of forced labor, because now you have, what's that?
Yeah, because you had steam power.
It's steam powered. You think about just the food revolution, the agriculture revolution, the amount of food we can produce. What fossil fuels have given us, it gets a bad rep because people have this sort of purist idea that we should move off of it. The reality is it has empowered our whole economy, and it has empowered everything that we sort of know in a modern life. Without it, we would be cavemen.
Yeah.
And it is such an important technology that is so underappreciated.
I think I love that you brought up the point of slave labor, because at a point in time that was the cheapest and most cost-effective form of energy. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it is. If you've ever watched the movie The Matrix, all the people in their pods, they're slaves. It's their energy being used to power the simulation. And that's how the world used to be. And going back to that Steve Jobs quote, that's what he's talking about. He's like, hydrocarbons and petrochemicals allowed humans to stop physically working and start thinking about technology. And you also look at it, we were using well oil in the United States, and we've decimated the whale population. We've killed 75% of the whales out there. And it's not hard to imagine that whales would be extinct if we weren't using, if we didn't discover oil in Pennsylvania and be able to use it. And so, and that gets into a whole other topic where I've got an entire thesis that we've killed the biological pump because we've killed the whales, which fertilize the plankton populations. Plankton are responsible for sequestering 40% of CO2. So you have fewer whales, fewer plankton, and we've messed up the entire biological pump. And so in a way, you can make a case that oil and gas really saved the whales and in turn saved the biological pump. And
refrigeration. I mean, look at what, I was the founder of Singapore, sort of the sort of godfather of, he was mayor, but he was sort of, really created that whole country, says that air conditioning is what enabled Singapore to become world power. I think about Houston. You live in Houston.
Yeah.
We live in Tennessee. If you think about pre-air conditioned times, what that life was like was pretty miserable in the South.
Yeah.
And what that has enabled is this development of these Southern economies, the development of us to be able to thrive, eliminate a lot of disease because we're not exposed to the elements, we're not exposed to insects the way we were, because before we couldn't survive in a hot building. Anyone who's been in Houston or in Tennessee without air conditioning knows that could not exist before.
Isn't it incredible how much we take air conditioning for granted?
Refrigeration.
Yeah.
Like food.
That's after a hurricane in Houston, you go a couple of days without a refrigerator and air conditioning. You're like, yeah, this sucks.
And then you'd be willing to burn wood inside your house.
Yes.
People were burning wood stoves. That was how they heated their homes, is they would and the amount of just carbon that they would breathe, and carbon dioxide, and just the soot they would bring in their homes just to heat it.
If you look at like early photographs of Chattanooga or Knoxville or any city in the Southeast from like say 1900 or 1880,
it was all
there's no trees.
Dirty. No, it was all.
They're all burned up.
Which guys, I could talk about some of these topics for hours, which we don't have today, but a couple of just different stories is I saw a video the other day, I believe it's produced by the World Economic Forum, and they were down with some villagers in Africa, and the mother of this family spends 14 hours of her day harvesting wood to cook with. And she just talked about how backbreaking it was. She, in the morning, wakes up, has to go find wood, cooks, goes, finds wood again, and that is all she does all day. And specifically, she said if we had natural gas, how much it would improve her life of being able to plumb in gas to heat. And not only that, all of her family, all of her kids deal with respiratory issues from burning wood inside their homes. And so if you think about that, saw a friend on Twitter the other day talking. He's a really big account. He's a digital nomad, so he's all over the world, and talked about how much we took air conditioning for granted. He was talking about his time in Europe. He's like, you don't realize how static we get as humans in heat. He's like, I wasn't thinking about working at all while I was outside. And the second I went into a cafe and they had air conditioning, all of a sudden I came out of this zone and I was just much more productive in thinking. And so we get very, just kind of, when you're in heat, your body's biological reaction is, hey,
completely different. That's why there isn't a lot of
shut down. And
if you look at historical development, economic development, you don't see it in the tropics. You don't see it because, for that very reason, disease, propensity to disease, climate wasn't conducive to those types of things. Even like animals were, would get highly exhausted in those parts of in those climates, and that's why we didn't see a lot of economic development in parts of the world that suffered from really significant heat.
Yeah, and on the opposite side of that, places where it's really cold as well. Humans have a much better ability to adapt to the heat than to the cold. You go up to the North Slope of Alaska, and I mean, it's hard to run generators and things when diesel gels up, and you're constantly having to, keep that in mind and run different boiler systems and things of this nature. Whereas in hot climates, we have figured out air conditioning.
And we would be remiss if we talk about air conditioning when we talk about refrigeration. I mean, refrigeration is also one of the most revolutionary technologies.
Yeah.
The ability to, we talked earlier about medicines but just food. We have a universal food supply because we're able to essentially cool it, and now you can get imported fruits from all over the world. You can have meats that are it has been so revolutionary, and it's brought to us by hydrocarbons.
I mean, it's incredible that you can just walk into a grocery store, this, Craig, but the grocery store in Texas called H-E-B. And you just walk into H-E-B and just have shelves full of fruits and vegetables and steaks, and you go to other parts of the world and that's not the case. And you look at supply chain, logistics, energy, manufacturing, all of these things are, very closely tied together, and it's a perfect system that works together. It's also a very fragile system too.
Very fragile and boring in the market.
Boring, yeah.
Which enables you and I to actually have careers and businesses because no one else wants to.
But I think that these things are getting the prime, the stage and the limelight now as Silicon Valley and tech is starting to understand how important energy is and how important supply chains are. And unfortunately, it took several wars in Russia and Ukraine and Israel to understand what
the pandemic.
Y'all were talking about Germany shutting down their nuclear plants. Germany's energy policy is just incredibly insane on all fronts. But there's a clip of Trump talking about
at the UN.
At the UN, and the German diplomats laughing at him.
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
But Russia wasn't able to attack Ukraine because they were able to complete the Nord Stream pipeline once Biden got back into the office. And then you have Germany is like, okay, well, we're going to shut off our nuclear, and they became dependent on Russian natural gas.
So they could guarantee that they wouldn't interfere.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was the calculation, right?
That's it. And innocent people die because of bad energy policy. And we see this in the United States too, guys. If you look at Boston and New England area, they are heavily dependent on natural gas to heat their homes and to electrify everything. And 80% of their electricity generation comes from that. And they import the natural gas from Africa and the Caribbean and Russia, even though Boston is 200.
Because pipelines can't be built.
Yeah. 200 miles away from the most prolific natural gas play in the world, in the Northeast, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and you can't build pipelines to get them natural gas. We also, with the Jones Act, we can't ship LNG from Houston up the coast to Boston, and so both Boston and California import a ton of oil and gas from countries that don't have the regulatory framework that we have, and it's just
Don't necessarily have our best interest.
best interest, and they definitely don't have our
Sounds
best
like you
interest.
should build a refinery in Bermuda. It's like right in the middle. Just like export it, just like pipes that go from one side to the other.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know. That's
yeah, no, trust
Jones
me.
Act lawyer will figure that one out.
I'm very vested in figuring out powering the United States and building infrastructure, and it's a very, I feel very fortunate to be in this time period where there's a lot of opportunity, and I'm very bullish on the United States and our ability to start building again, and so I think that's enabled by energy, and obviously will be enabled by shipping and logistics and manufacturing.
You know, I love your Twitter account because it's a world you're evangelizing oil and gas, the importance of it, what's happening on the ground. You create a lot of energy and passion to it. You're making it a fun topic for most people, what would most otherwise assume not to be. This is so important because educating the general population that we can't have EVs without power and without energy is so important.
Yeah.
And so I applaud you. You can reach it at FracSlap for those that want to follow you on Twitter.
Yeah. Twitter, TikTok, any social media platform. My handle is FracSlap. So always happy to connect with people and educate. It's something that I'm very passionate about. And
that's F-R-A-C.
Yeah, F-R-A-C.
FRAC, yeah.
Just in the know.
Yeah, no K.
Just
This
no
is a big topic within oil and gas. If fracking spelled with a K or without a K.
There's no K in the word fracture.
Yeah. So no K. It's just FRAC and then slap. And so also just want to give a shout out to the biggest natural gas producer in the world, EQT. They've got a pad that's coming live in Ohio. It's the FracSlap pad, and so it's going to be a banger of a.
They
pad.
named it after you?
Yeah, they named it after me.
Amazing.
So, yeah. Hey, Toby, is there a FracSlap pad? Can you confirm? Is it happening?
Yeah, that's confirmed.
It's confirmed. Best asset they're gonna have. Gonna be banger wells.
Yeah,
I haven't got any freight people
company named after
need a
you.
rail car.
It's-
I don't know.
I already-
need a rail car or like a
We need to work on that. Someone needs to do that. But yeah, I think EQT was smart. This is going to be the best barn burner of a natural gas asset in the United States. So
When is it coming live?
so they've already started constructing the pad. I think that they've already got it permitted, but I think it'll come online. They'll start drilling it next year.
We need to feature it when it actually.
That's what. Yeah, I would love.
The
Yeah,
fracs-
we should
I
do
love
it.
that,
Yeah.
by the way. That's
You know what's
awesome.
funny is I've heard about it for a couple of years through the grapevine through some of their engineers, but someone on Twitter was driving home from a football game the other day and drove by the lease sign on the side of the road, and they stopped and took a picture of it, and so it is incredibly cool to actually see that it's
awesome.
coming to life.
Amazing.
That's cool.
Such a cool story. So, Collin, really appreciate you coming in. You can follow him at Frac, F-R-A-C, Slap, on Twitter, on X, TikTok, and Instagram. Really great follow. Recommend it. We'll be back, talk about more American reindustrialization. So much happening. Oil and gas is such an important topic. It's something that really needs to be honed in. We lead the world in production of energy, as well as energy innovation and manufacturing. It's a really important topic. We'll continue to dive into that at Bring It Home. We'll have you back another time to talk about another major topic in American reindustrialization.